So for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing the 1972 Godzilla movie, Godzilla vs. Gigan. A movie that was made in response to the previous Godzilla movie, Godzilla vs. Ghidorah, because Toho producer Tomiyuki Tanaka thought Godzilla vs. Ghidorah was a very unconventional movie set within the Godzilla franchise, and wanted the next installment after Godzilla vs. Ghidorah to be more of a conventional Godzilla movie that people were more familiar with, and decided to hire returning director Jun Fukuda, who you might recognize from directing previous Godzilla movies, Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster and Son of Godzilla. Now, as for the actual production of Godzilla vs. Gigan, this movie went through a couple drafts. And this is where the information gets confusing for me, because there's one website that says this draft came first, followed by this draft, while some other websites say it's the other way around. However, upon doing further research, I think I get which draft came first. Starting with what I presume is the actual first draft of this movie, Godzilla vs. the Space Monsters, Earth Defense Directive. And the plot would have been about this large, brain-like alien that would have came to Earth with the intention to conquer it using 3 alien monsters, one of them being King Ghidorah, with the other 2 being 2 new alien monsters, Gigan and Megalon. Sometime later, Godzilla and Anguirus show up in Tokyo to battle the 3 space monsters, and as the battle progresses, a giant statue of a fictional Inca god called Majin Tool would have somehow come to life, assisting Godzilla and Anguirus battling the 3 space monsters. However, this script would have ultimately been reworked into a new draft called The Return of King Ghidorah. And as for the plot to this particular draft, the story is a more extravagant version of what would ultimately become Godzilla vs. Gigan, but the monster roster would have been completely different. Whereas with the previous draft, it featured Godzilla and Anguirus, Majin Tool battling King Ghidorah, Gigan, and Megalon. This movie, it would have featured Godzilla, Rodan, and Varan facing off against the space monsters, King Ghidorah, Gigan, which would have had a spike ball for one of its hands, and a new monster called Moogle, which was said to be like this flying dragon-like creature. However, because of the limited budget the movie had, some major changes were made to the script. The first major change was reducing the monster roster from having 6 monsters to 4, because it would have required the producers at Toho to create 3 brand new suits, 2 of them for the new monsters Gigan and Moogle, and a third one for Varan. The second major change to the script was replacing both Rodan and Varan with Anguirus, since the producers wanted to take advantage of the new Anguirus suit that had been created for the 1968 movie Destroy All Monsters. And eventually, the flying dragon monster Mogu would be dropped from the script altogether, while one of the concepts from the previous draft would be brought back for this script, thus leading to the eventual creation of the movie we're about to talk about today, Godzilla vs. Gigan. Which brings us to our question: is Godzilla vs. Gigan a more conventional Godzilla movie in comparison to its previous installment, Godzilla vs. Ghidorah? As for the plot of the movie, a cartoonist soon begins employment at a upcoming amusement park. But as time goes on, he soon suspects that something is wrong with his employers, which leads him into joining a group of conspiracy theorists who manage to get their hands on a recording that contains secrets from the amusement park. Upon listening to the recording, it appears that there was nothing but nonsensical sounds contained within the reels. However, unknown to them, the more they continue to play the recording, it secretly sends out this high-pitched noise that soon attracts the attention of both the employees of the amusement park, who turn out to be alien invaders, along with Earth monsters Godzilla and Anguirus, that force the alien invaders to call upon the space monsters King Ghidorah and Gigan. And with the giant monsters battling one another, it's up to our main cast of heroes to stop the alien invaders before they take over Earth. In terms of what I liked about the movie, contrary to popular belief, this is the movie that introduced the tag team monster battles, because a lot of people state that Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster was the first movie to introduce the tag team monster battles. That isn't true, because with that movie, it wasn't 2 monsters battling 2 monsters. Instead, it was 3 monsters battling 1 monster altogether. So if anything, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster introduced us to a giant monster battle royale. With this movie, on the other hand, we actually do have tag team monster battles with Godzilla and Anguirus battling Gigan and King Ghidrah. And this movie would basically set a trend that would continue for the remaining Godzilla movies during the Shōwa era of the Godzilla franchise. I also think that the combination of the set designs for the human characters along with the small-scale miniatures for the monster characters are well designed and serve the function that they were intended for. Granted, I do think that around this time period, the physical special effects are pretty standard for a Godzilla movie, and there are some numerous problems on the technical aspect of the movie, which I'll talk about later, but I do think that the effects themselves are generally good. I also like the mystery aspect to the movie where you have the main group of characters that get caught up in some kind of conspiracy and they're trying to figure out the mystery behind it, because I don't think that's ever been done before in a Godzilla movie. Granted, the mystery itself is pretty easy to solve once you know the type of Godzilla movie this is gonna be, but I think it was cool for a Godzilla movie to incorporate a mystery aspect to its story. I also think that the movie has some good cinematography, albeit I think that the type of camera movements and shot composures are pretty standard for a Godzilla movie, but good nonetheless. Although there is one camera angle that I did think was really unique, and it revolves around the points in time where you have the main cast of characters trying to figure out the mystery behind the amusement park, and you see them get into the car, and then we have a POV shot from the car's point of view driving down a street. And the way the POV shot is set up, the shot itself looks like a wide shot, but has like this weird distorted filter over it to give the illusion of like a fisheye lens effect, which makes the shot look interesting, albeit gimmicky, but interesting. I also think that the movie has some really good lighting regardless if the scene takes place during the day or at night, especially the monster battle itself, where you get to see all the details on the monster costumes and the small-scale miniatures, at least in comparison to the previous Godzilla movie, Godzilla vs. Ghidorah, where in some night scenes, the lighting was so poor that you could barely make out what was going on. This here, you see everything. But perhaps the best usage of lighting in this movie occurs sometime near the end of the movie when you have the main cast of characters who are captured by the main villains and they're in the Godzilla tower. At one point, the power goes out and an emergency generator kicks in. We see one of the main characters reacting to something horrific. Next thing you know, we cut to this shot of a silhouette of a giant cockroach. The camera pans down, revealing the origin of where that shadow came from, which is a cool way to reveal the true identity of what the aliens themselves look like without actually showing what the aliens look like, using your imagination to fill in the gaps. Although I do think this illusion gets ruined later in the movie when we do get our full reveal of what the aliens themselves look like through some bad compositing shots. I also like the overall setting to the movie where it primarily takes place at a children's amusement park, because that's never really been done before in a Godzilla movie. Now sure, the original 1964 Godzilla vs. Mothra movie did have a amusement park of sorts, but if I had to really be honest, the amusement park featured in that movie was more of a roadside attraction than an actual amusement park. With the set in this movie, it's a lot more fun and colorful to look at, and actually does look like a full functioning amusement park in some shape or form. And it's also pretty cool to see the giant monsters have their final battle at this location, for the simple reason that here's a location that's usually associated with bringing happiness to a lot of people, but has instead become this battleground for these giant monsters as they fight each other to the death. And the giant monster battle itself gets so brutal that this marks the first time that Godzilla has ever shed blood in any Godzilla movie. I also think that the movie has a really good soundtrack, for the simple reason that the soundtrack presented within this movie is different from your typical musical score that you would hear in your average Godzilla movie. Now sure, there are some musical scores that are done by a.k.a. that are sprinkled throughout the movie, but the soundtrack to this movie is primarily made up of new material. And I think the reason as to why the music composers a.k.a. along with Kuno Mayuchi is primarily in response to the type of soundtrack that was featured in Godzilla vs. Ghidorah, where that soundtrack was very strange for a Godzilla movie, but with this soundtrack, it's got a lot of familiar beats, but presented in a new way, if that makes any sense. I also like the plan that the aliens have in store for Godzilla, where instead of trying to mind control Godzilla to use as a weapon of mass destruction against the humans, the aliens instead try to kill Godzilla to take over Earth, which is very unique for a alien invasion movie set within the Godzilla franchise. Because with other Godzilla movies like Godzilla vs. Monster Zero or Destroy All Monsters, the aliens that appeared in those movies typically mind-controlled Godzilla to use as a weapon against mankind in order to take over Earth. With this movie, on the other hand, by having the aliens attempting to kill Godzilla and potentially all the other Earth monsters in order to take over Earth itself is refreshing, because it shows that you can take a familiar storyline that's been done before, but go in a different direction with it. Now, sure, I do have some problems with the aliens' plan to kill Godzilla, but I'll talk about those later. I also like the inclusion of the new monster, Gigan, because he's a very unique monster in terms of both personality and design. Because if I had to describe these two aspects, personality-wise, Gigan is basically the Godzilla equivalent of Starscream from the Transformers franchise. Design-wise, Gigan has a very memorable design for several reasons. The first reason, his design on pen and paper should not translate to the big screen. Because if I had to describe his design, imagine if someone took a rooster, a cycloptic robot, a Spinosaurus, and a bunch of power tools, put those into a blender, and you get Gigan. And that's a design that just sounds too ridiculous to be any good. Yet the filmmakers somehow managed to take this ridiculous design and find a way to make it work to the movie's advantage. As for the second reason, within the context of the Godzilla franchise, Gigan looks very out of place, to a point that Gigan should have appeared in a tokusatsu TV show like Ultraman or Super Sentai as opposed to a Godzilla movie. Yet, after seeing him interact with the likes of Godzilla, Anguirus, and King Ghidorah, Gigan fits in pretty nicely within the Godzilla franchise. In terms of what I disliked about the movie, much like Godzilla's Revenge, this movie is also infamous for its usage of stock footage from other Toho movies. And this is where things get kinda weird, because if you've seen any other movie review focused on Godzilla vs. Gigan, sure, some of those reviewers do bring up the stock footage, but they only bring up the stock footage that came from Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster and Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, using the action sequences revolved around Godzilla battling King Ghidorah in both of those movies. And when this movie shows that stock footage, it has this ugly yellow filter over it. And many people point this out because it does stick out like a sore thumb. And as I mentioned before, this is the part of the reviews that I find to be really weird, because people only focus on that stock footage. Because the thing is, this movie doesn't just take stock footage from Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster or Godzilla vs. Monster Zero. It takes stock footage from several other Godzilla movies, ranging from Rodan, Mothra vs. Godzilla, Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, The War of the Gargantuas, Son of Godzilla, Destroy All Monsters. It even takes stock footage from the previous two Godzilla movies, those being Godzilla's Revenge and Godzilla vs. Hedorah. Keep in mind, Godzilla's Revenge is already infamous for being a clip show that uses nothing but stock footage from other Godzilla movies, and the fact that Godzilla vs. Gigan uses stock footage from just as many Godzilla movies, yet people don't complain about it as much as Godzilla's Revenge, is something I find to be incredibly weird. And to add on top of that, if you paid attention to my movie reviews long enough, you already know my stance on movies that use excessive amounts of stock footage from other movies. Another aspect of the movie I didn't like is the fact that this is yet another Godzilla movie that does the alien invasion storyline. Because we already had Godzilla vs. Monster Zero and Destroy All Monsters do that exact same storyline with much better results. Granted, I will admit, this one goes about the alien invasion story in a different avenue, in that sense where the aliens are a lot more sneaky, and their primary plan is actually really interesting, where instead of taking control of Godzilla, they want to kill Godzilla, which is definitely different. I just think that the movie itself did not need to be an alien invasion story. Instead, I think the filmmakers should have had the employees of the amusement park be members of the Ram Bamboo from Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, as opposed to alien invaders, because when you sit down and think about it, between the two alien races that appeared in Godzilla vs. Monster Zero and Destroy All Monsters, they took advantage of the giant monsters when it came to invading Earth itself. Yet the aliens in this movie only want to take control of two space monsters and used those two space monsters to destroy all the monsters that live on Earth in order to conquer it. That to me seems like a missed opportunity on the aliens' behalf, because the aliens themselves are trying to invade Earth by mind controlling some giant monsters, and the planet they're trying to invade happens to come with its own resource of giant monsters to mind control. Yet they just want to conquer the planet with two space monsters and destroy the rest of them because they don't need them. Which is really different as far as a Godzilla alien invasion movie is concerned, but I feel like if this movie was rewritten, you could have replaced the alien invaders in this movie with an organization like the Red Bamboo, because one, Godzilla has fought against the Red Bamboo before back in Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, and maybe this is like a branch organization that discovers, well, Godzilla seemed to be a problem the last time, why don't we try to destroy him this time around? I think that would make a lot more sense. I only bring this up because within the context of the universe, there has got to be several groups of people out there who either want to destroy all the monsters on Earth or who want to protect them. So I think that would have been a very interesting dynamic to explore in this movie if the main villains were members of the Red Bamboo or some other terrorist organization as opposed to some alien invaders. Another problem that I had with the movie is the overall message, because the message itself is yet another anti-pollution message. And the thing is, Godzilla vs. Ghidorah already did this message, so I just find its placement within this movie to be very redundant. Granted, I am well aware that the anti-pollution movement was a big thing around this time period, but still, having the same message twice in a row, I think was just a bit too much. And sure, the way the movie goes about the message in this movie is handled more subtly than it was in Godzilla vs. Ghidorah, but the way it's included into this movie feels more like an afterthought as opposed to being the actual point of the movie. Another problem that I have with the movie is revolved around the pacing within the context of the story for both the human and monster characters, because I think the movie moves at a very slow pace for a couple reasons, starting with the human aspect of the story. Reason number one, within the first 10 to 15 minutes of the movie, a mystery is set up. The mystery in question revolves around the main character trying to figure out what is the deal with the employees at this amusement park, and rather than not, they're connected to a person that went missing days before. But here's the thing, once the actual mystery aspect of the movie begins, you already know that not only have the employees of the amusement park kidnapped said person, but they're also aliens through simple exchanges in lines of dialogue. Which makes it the more frustrating because we spend the rest of the movie with a cast of characters that you really don't care about in the long run, that are not only trying to solve this mystery that you know the answer to, but it takes the main cast of characters an extra 30 to 40 minutes to actually figure out the mystery itself, which makes the first 2/3 of this movie really boring to watch. As for the monster action, in the first half of the movie, nothing really happens, because when you do focus on the monsters, you only see about 20 to 30 seconds of Godzilla interacting with Anguirus, and then it just cuts back to the human story. And as far as the space monsters go, King Ghidorah and Gigan don't show up until halfway through the movie, when they begin their rampage, and sometime around the 50-minute mark of the movie, that's when we get our big monster battle with Godzilla and Anguirus battling King Ghidorah and Gigan. And keep in mind, the movie itself is roughly 80 to 90 minutes in length, and if you're someone who's only watching this movie to see the monster battle itself, you might get frustrated because it does take a while for the monster action to get started. Which leads into another problem that I have with the movie, that being the monster battle itself, I think is pretty lackluster in comparison to any other giant monster battle that occurred before or after this movie within the Shōwa era of the Godzilla franchise. And I know that sounds really weird because with Godzilla vs. Ghidorah, I was praising those fight scenes because of how lackluster they were, but here's the difference. With the giant monster battles featured in Godzilla vs. Ghidorah, the actual battles themselves are choreographed in such a weird way that they became unintentionally funny to watch. With the giant monster battles in this movie, the fight choreography is pretty standard to a point that it becomes very dull to watch. Now sure, there are some standout moments like the points in time where we have Gigan using his buzzsaw to cut up both Godzilla and Anguirus on separate occasions. I just wish there was more of that throughout the entire monster battle itself. Then there are the numerous technical issues I have with the movie. And this includes everything from sound design to editing to some of the technical effects. Starting with the sound design, because there are certain points in time where audio just cuts out during some scenes where you might have a character talking, then there's just brief moments of no dialogue whatsoever in a place where there should be dialogue. Then you have the sound effects revolved around the monster Anguirus, because in the first half of the movie, there's a few sequences where Anguirus is making sounds, but his mouth never moves. And this just confuses me. Like, how is he able to make these sounds when his mouth isn't moving? Then you have the editing to the movie, and in certain places, it's bad. Like, the scene that sticks out to me the most occurs sometime before the monster battle in which we see Gigan and King Ghidrah going on a rampage. Because they first begin their rampage by destroying a city. One edit later, they somehow go from the cityscape to the countryside, in which we see the military attacking both monsters. And because the editing is so weird, it makes me ask a few questions like how and why would the two space monsters end up in the countryside? Wouldn't it make more sense for them to be in the city landscape still? Because eventually, after both monsters destroy the military, they soon find themselves destroying a factory on the coastline, and a few moments later, Godzilla and Anguirus show up to do battle with them. So, in short, I think it would have been a lot better if maybe there was a few scenes of the military attacking both space monsters while both of them are still in the city landscape, as opposed to a country landscape. That way, the editing flow would have been paced a lot better, and within the context of the movie would have made a lot more sense for having the space monsters go from point A to point B. Then you have the special effects themselves, and oh boy, they're not very good in this, and there are many examples that I can list. And for my first example, it's revolved around the few shots in which we see both Godzilla and Anguirus swimming. Because when we do see both monsters swimming, they're usually depicted as men-in-suit creations. But once in a great while, we'll have a bird's-eye view of both monsters swimming, which is a cool shot. However, during these aerial shots, the monsters are depicted using either toys or models of the two monsters as opposed to men-in-suit creations. And it just looks bad. Like, it reminds me of that one aerial shot from Godzilla Raids Again, and not in a good way either. For my second example, it's kind of like my first example, but instead of focusing on the Earth monsters swimming in certain shots, this is more focused on the space monsters, Gigan and King Ghidrah, flying. In that sense where there are several shots of the two monsters flying, but instead of using men-in-suit creations to depict the two monsters flying, the producers or the special effects team decided to use two puppets. And the two puppets in question look terrible, especially the puppet used for King Ghidrah, because there is no movement to him whatsoever. And I think the worst shot in the entire movie that features these two monsters flying is the point in time where you see both Gigan and King Ghidrah flying around the Godzilla Tower, where not only do the filmmakers continue to use these terrible looking puppets, but there's also really bad chroma key effects used here as well. And speaking of which, this leads into my third example, that being the chroma key effects themselves. Because in the few shots that feature chroma key effects, all but one scene that utilize these type of effects looks bad and outdated. Not so much by today's standards, but by the standards that were presented around that time period. And for my fourth example, much like Godzilla vs. Ghidorah, two different Godzilla costumes are used. One costume is used for the scenes in which Godzilla is seen on land, and the other costume is used when we see Godzilla swimming. And the thing is, the two costumes in question don't look anything alike. Because at least with the costume that's used for Godzilla when he's on land is the same costume that's used in the previous three movies. Whereas the costume that's used for Godzilla swimming in this movie, I don't know if it's me, but I swear to God, it looks like the Godzilla costume that was used in Son of Godzilla, and that costume looked terrible, at least in the facial area. And when you actually do compare that costume with the costume predominantly featured in this movie, they look nothing alike. Another problem that I had with the movie are the fact that there are some plot points that don't make any sense. The primary one being the first time the main character encounters one of the lead female characters of the movie. Because during this sequence, he's trying to walk into this building, she comes out running, accidentally drops a tape, runs a far distance, goes around the corner of a building. A few moments later, the employees of the amusement park come out asking the main character what direction the girl ran. He points the opposite direction, they run the opposite direction, spots the tape, picks it up. Later that night, he walks back to his apartment. The girl shows up demanding the tape because she claims that she watched him pick up the tape. And this is the part of the movie that doesn't make any sense to me. Because how could she have known that he would pick up the tape? Because as I said moments ago, she continued running the opposite direction and had her back to the main character and ran around the building. So there's no way she could have known he would have picked up the tape. Another problem I have of the movie revolves around King Ghidorah, because this is King Ghidorah's overall 4th appearance in a Godzilla movie, but this is the 3rd time in a row in which King Ghidorah is someone else's bitch. And I think that really brings him down as a character, because in his first appearance, King Ghidorah was basically described as being the Godzilla equivalent to Galactus from the Marvel comics. And this is his 4th appearance, and he's just a puppet to someone else. And to me, that makes him less threatening. Like, imagine you're in a Marvel comic, and instead of having Galactus being this terrifying character, he was the puppet to a villain like Doctor Doom. Also, in my personal opinion, I could have done without King Ghidorah in this movie. Not because of the fact that King Ghidorah is yet someone else's bitch, but when you really watch him interact with some of the other monsters in the movie, he's not as lively or energetic. Hell, the stock footage the movie uses from Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster along with Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, you watch the stock footage of Ghidorah going on a rampage, he's a lot more energetic and lively. In this movie, he just stands around and barely does a thing. Also, I didn't really think that the aliens themselves were really all that interesting. I mean, sure, their plan to take over Earth is handled differently from the Exilians and Kilax, but the group of aliens that appear in this movie, at the end of the day, are just giant alien cockroaches that take over the bodies of dead people. Wait a minute. The aliens in this movie are giant alien cockroaches that take over the bodies of dead people. Did Men in Black steal from this? So, for my final verdict of Godzilla vs. Gigan, remember how I said at the very start of the review how the producers wanted this movie to be a more conventional Godzilla movie in response to Godzilla vs. Ghidorah? Well, the movie does succeed in being a conventional Godzilla movie, just not in a good way. The reason as to why I bring this up, because the producers wanted Godzilla vs. Gigan to be a more conventional Godzilla movie in comparison to Godzilla vs. Ghidorah, they basically wanted to play it safe and not take any risks, and because of that, I feel that's where the movie suffers the most, which is a real shame because this is the 3rd Godzilla movie to be directed by Jun Fukuda, and if you saw my reviews of Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster and Son of Godzilla, I stated that I wasn't the biggest fan of the monsters that Godzilla fought in those movies, but I did like the story and the characters surrounding the monster action. With this movie, on the other hand, it's the other way around, where I love the new addition of Gigan, but I just felt that the story and characters were incredibly weak, and because of that, I think that Godzilla vs. Gigan is one of those Godzilla movies that you can skip and not miss anything. So, overall, Godzilla vs. Gigan is a movie that's way too conventional for its own good, but does feature a cool monster in the form of Gigan. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Godzilla vs. Gigan? So it looks like the movie got mixed to negative reception. And for my final rating of Godzilla vs. Gigan, I give it a 2 out of 5. So, between the 2 drafts that this movie went through, what script would you like to have seen as the final product? And see you later.